Welcome to episode 83 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Gary Noesner, who served in the FBI for more than 30 years, 4 as a support employee and 26 as a special agent. During his bureau career, Gary was an investigator, instructor, and hostage negotiator. A significant focus of his career was directed towards investigating and negotiating numerous crisis incidents covering police riots, right-wing militia standoffs, religious zealot sieges, terrorist embassy takeovers, airplane hijackings, and over 120 overseas kidnapping cases involving American citizens. In this episode, Gary reviews the importance of hostage negotiations and stalling for time, and how these concepts were used during the Montana Freeman siege incident. Prior to retiring from the Bureau, Gary was chief of the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Unit under the Critical Incident Response Group. He was actually the first person to hold that position. Gary Noesner continues to consult independently and speaks at law enforcement conferences and corporate gatherings around the world. Gary has appeared on numerous television news programs and documentaries and has been interviewed in major publications addressing hostage negotiation, terrorism, and kidnapping. He has written a book about his career, Stalling for Time: My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. The book serves as the basis for a 6-part miniseries on the 1993 Waco siege incident. This miniseries will air on the Paramount Network in January 2018. Gary can be contacted for presentations and speeches via his website, GaryNoesner.com. I think you're really going to enjoy this interview with Gary Noesner, not just because we learn about hostage and crisis negotiations, but because Gary shows us how we can use some of these same methods in our dealings with family members and coworkers. It's really pretty fascinating. One of the tips that I will always remember is when he talks about dealing with frustrating and irritating people. And he says, don't get angry, get your way. I like that. Before we get to the interview, I know that during the last couple of episodes, I keep talking about reaching 1 million downloads. And actually, this is the episode that's going to get us there. Who knows? You could be the person listening to the 1 millionth download. So let's assume you are, and all I have to say is thank you for being a loyal listener of FBI Retired Case File Review. You're the best. I will be giving you your bonus episode as a way of celebration. You can expect that to be posted on Tuesday, September the 19th. To help me celebrate, please review FBI Retired Case File Review on iTunes or whatever podcast app you use to listen to the show. Also, I'd like for you to consider joining the FBI Retired Case File Review reader team. Just once a month, I send you an email about the FBI and books, TV, and movies. I also have links to each episode show notes from the month before, so you can look at the pictures and click on the newspaper articles. The best part of joining the FBI Retired Case File Review reader team is that you get the FBI Reading Resource, which is a list of books about the FBI written by the very FBI agents who have appeared on this podcast. All you have to do is go to jerrywilliams.com and sign up when you see the pop-up. The last thing is, I mentioned to you last week that the audiobook of my crime novel, Pay to Play, is out. Last week, I attached a chapter where the main character, the female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry, was introduced. At the end of this episode, I include the chapter where you get to meet the corrupt licensing and inspection official she's investigating. So stick around after Gary Noesner's interview to check that out. When you pick up a copy of Pay to Play for yourself or as a gift for someone you know loves crime fiction, you're helping to defray the cost for me to continue to produce ad-free content on a weekly basis. Plus, as I've been told, Pay to Play is a great read. So, thank you. Now here's the show. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce my guest, Gary Noesner. Hey, Gary.
Hi, Jerry.
I use the word thrilled because that's where we met, at Thriller Fest this year. And Thriller Fest is the world's largest conference for authors of mysteries and crime fiction and, of course, thrillers. And you were a presenter there.
Yes, it was a great conference and a great opportunity to meet a lot of writers who are both currently very successful and up and coming.
Yeah, and for me, when I saw you on the schedule, I'm always thinking about my podcast, and I thought, oh, I've got to go to that and ask if you would be a guest on FBI Retired Case File Review. I did that. You said yes, and here we are.
Here we are, ready to go.
Ready to go. So I loved your presentation. It was absolutely fascinating. So I do want you to do part of that presentation for my listeners. And then I thought, because this is called Case File Review, that we would take one of the cases that you worked on as a hostage negotiator and kind of review that in a little bit more detail.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I mean, I think negotiations is essentially effective interpersonal communications, and even beyond the law enforcement aspect of used in hostage negotiation, crisis negotiations, I think every person can benefit from improving their ability to listen effectively and to create a relationship of trust, whether it's at home or work, personal relationships. So it's something a lot of us do without thinking, but if we put some thought into it, I think we can all improve our communication skills and be more effective.
I know one of the things that I learned from your presentation is that negotiations is basically stalling for time, which is so cool because that's the name of your book. And the book itself is called Stalling for Time, My Life as a FBI Hostage Negotiator. Could you tell us more about that concept?
Yeah, one of the, in the early days of negotiations when I got my initial training, I noticed in my old note-taking guide that the first 3 words were on my note paper were stall for time. And, they say in the medical profession, first do no harm. And in the negotiation profession, if you can do nothing else, stall for time. Not that we're purposely trying to slow down or elongate the situation for its own sake, but rather we found that by taking our time, we lower emotions and deconflict a very tense situation, bringing people that we're dealing with who are often in crisis to a point where they can make better decisions and cooperate with us to resolve it peacefully. So that's kind of the basic concept. Sometimes some feel that law enforcement negotiations, it's what's taking so long? Why are we spending all this time listening to this person's personal problems? But what those critics don't realize is we're developing a relationship. We're demonstrating to this person that we feel they're worthy of our respect and they're worthy of us listening to them attentively and letting them know we understand whatever problems or issues they're dealing with and how they feel about it. It's a very powerful tool that law enforcement borrowed from the counseling community that we use to create a relationship of trust in a short, tense period of time that has a very high effective result in resolving situations favorably and peacefully.
Well, what are some of the things that you're trying to accomplish during a time period where you're stalling for time?
Well, oftentimes there's a variety of different kind of incidents that police respond to, and FBI negotiators. But people are obviously having the worst day of their life if they're interacting with a hostage negotiator, and so there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of angst, and they expect we in law enforcement as negotiators to show up and be very demanding, to be authoritative, to employ our command voice, and to tell them what they have to do and threaten consequences if they don't. That's sort of the expectation, and then instead they get an individual that calls them by their first name and doesn't throw around an authoritative voice and says, "Hey, I know you're having a lot of really troubling issues today, and I'd like to hear about it, and because I want to help you. I'm here to help you get out of this situation." And that's a bit disarming for the perpetrators at first, but what it does through the passage of time is convey likability and genuineness and establishes some trust and some rapport. And based on that, the negotiator can begin to suggest alternatives to violence that, now that has been established, will be more likely, embraced by the perpetrator than continued resistance.
So what kind of methods do you use? You talked about using a first name, and I guess I can see how that can establish, especially if you're letting him or her use your first name too. But what other kind of things help with that rapport building?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's a calm voice and a tone that you generally want to help them, and you're just not aggressive in your interaction with them. You're not officious and demanding, and I think these sorts of approaches have proven very effective.
Are there situations where there's like a ticking time, clock going? Are you always able to stall for time? And do you have outside pressure from management or safety of hostages? When is stalling for time not an option?
The passage of time is almost always a positive development for achieving the end result. However, there are some rare circumstances. For example, if someone is seriously wounded inside and is bleeding to death, or there's a wounded officer on the front doorstep that we can't get to, those would be very rare and very unique circumstances where now time, in essence, is working against us. But those are anomalies. In almost, the very high 90 percentile of situations, we tend to gain through slowing it down. We make better decisions. We allow better law enforcement resources to respond to the scene. It gives us time to gather intelligence and information about the person we're dealing with, and to generally do a better and more effective job in restoring a calm to the situation and engaging this person in a meaningful way so we can achieve a positive outcome.
You use the word negotiations, which to me means that both sides have a give and take. So what kind of things would law enforcement be willing to give, and what would they be exchanging those things for?
Yeah, I think you brought up a very good point, Jerry. Negotiations tends to mean I'm going to give up some things, you're going to give up some things. In reality, in law enforcement negotiations, we're going to be victorious. The perpetrator, the hostage holder, is not going to succeed. If they rob a bank and they're holding hostages, we're not going to let them leave the bank with the hostages and the money and live happily ever after. That's not going to happen. So in essence, negotiations for us means more quality communications where we're listening, we're hearing that person's frustrations, but we're moving them gently along to a point where they realize, in the case of the bank robber, where they're left with two basic options, and that is cooperate with the FBI negotiators and come out peacefully and live, or harm a hostage and run the risk of being seriously injured or killed. Those end up being the two options, and when thrown in someone's face at the beginning of an incident, they're not ready to accept that, but after time has been invested in establishing a relationship and having a dialogue, then they come to trust that what the negotiator is telling them does in fact make sense and is reasonable and really does showcase that their options are not as great as they think. Their power over law enforcement is not as full as they thought.
Now, I know during your Fest presentation, you talked about one of your very first negotiations. It was on a train. Could you take us through that and, tell us, since that was one of your very first ones, what are some of the key things that you learned from that made you better as you got more experience?
Yeah, this was a situation in the early 80s. A Colombian from the Miami area was traveling back and forth with New York, and he was running drugs, and he was using his sister and her 2 young children as sort of his disguise. So they traveled with him to appear to look like a regular family unit. Somewhere in the middle of the night as the train traveled north, they got into some serious argument. He ended up killing his sister, shooting her. And the train detached the cars involved in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the police began to try to open up a dialogue. The perpetrator refused to communicate with the police. So after a period of time, myself and some other agents were flown down, including a Spanish-speaking negotiator. And through persistence and calm projection of voice and demonstration of sincerity, some of the issues that I mentioned earlier here, we were able to finally open a dialogue with the fellow involved. Sadly, the young infant who was with him had died of dehydration by the time we were able to get him to start talking with us. But we were able to save the second child, and he ultimately surrendered. It's often a matter of persistence and people getting these situations that are based on their outburst of rage and anger and frustration. And very often we find they don't know how to get out of them. And one of the biggest roles of a negotiator is to get them to that point where they can make decisions. And that's what we're able to do in this situation.
I know that you are also an instructor, that you teach negotiations. Mm-hmm. Can you teach anybody negotiations? Is there a personality or, for instance, I know we have the undercover school at the FBI, and they do an evaluation, and they try to determine whether this person would be a good fit for an undercover role. Does the same thing occur for negotiators?
To some extent. In the FBI today, I think they do a pretty good job of identifying potential negotiators. Each field office has a team of negotiators. They typically will have someone function as an auxiliary, negotiator before they're allowed to go through the National Crisis Negotiation course at Quantico. But I feel anybody can be taught the skills, but as with any other endeavor, not everybody's going to be as good as someone else. Everyone can be taught to throw a football, but you're not going to all end up being Tom Brady. So, not everyone may have the temperament or skill set to be as successful, but most people can learn from the skills, and people tend to gravitate to negotiation work who have a great deal of self-control. They tend to be, in the FBI's way of looking at things, they're good interviewers, they're good interrogators, they're good source developers. They're the kind of agents that are really effective in bringing cases to court because they've been able to get people to give them testimony that's helpful for prosecution. So it's those kinds of similar skills, but obviously we train those skills. We train abnormal psychology. We run them through role playing, incident case studies. It's an intense course, and some people find that they're not particularly well suited for it, but most people gain some helpful skills in the course, and then of course some of them become absolutely incredibly effective negotiators.
How much does whether or not you're an effective negotiator depend on the personality of the person that you're trying to negotiate with?
Well, there are some extraordinarily challenging individuals to negotiate with. I mean, the most infamous, of course, was the Waco incident with David Koresh. Dealing with him was, truly unique and probably the hardest negotiation I or anybody else was ever involved in. But most individuals, even though they may not have a positive viewpoint of law enforcement or the FBI at the beginning of the incident, if we're effective as communicators, as negotiators, we can generally get to a point where we can get their cooperation. But obviously, if alcohol or drugs are playing a role, if mental health, the person has a severe psychosis, there can be a number of factors that make some cases harder than others. Perhaps amongst the most dangerous is suicide. Police officers, police negotiators are more likely to engage in a situation where there's loss of life in suicide. Those are very hard. There's ambivalence in a suicide. The reason the person hasn't killed himself yet is part of them wants to live and a part of them wants to die. And that's the proverbial foot in the door that we as negotiators try to use. Just using the example of the salesman who wants to open the dialogue. That's what we try to do, and we're very successful in getting people to step back from the ledge or put the gun down from their head. But if you work enough of those, you will confront someone who is more inclined to carry through their self-destructive act, regardless of the quality of the effort you put in to try to keep them alive.
That's a good point, because when you think of negotiators, the word hostage is usually attached. But in the situations that you just described, there are no hostages. You are negotiating just with this individual. And I guess in that situation, there may not be as much to talk about or to, I'm trying to think of the right word to deal with.
We don't have as much leverage. I mean, there's no question that a pure hostage situation is one in which the individual we're dealing with, the perpetrator as you would, is trying to achieve something they can't on their own, whether it's get money, political change, whatever it might be, win an argument of some kind. They can't achieve it on their own, so they hold a hostage and threaten to kill them unless they get what they want. Now, they go into these situations feeling pretty empowered because they feel they hold all the cards by threatening the life of a hostage. And then through our negotiations and slowing down the process, they slowly come to the realization that they can't make us jump through hoops and do whatever they want. And they ultimately are faced with that decision to cooperate or be harmed or killed. So those are hostage situations. And the success rate in those is, believe it or not, very, very, very high. It's very rare for a hostage to be killed in any kind of an incident. But that's only 10% of what police FBI negotiators do. 90% are these emotionally driven situations, whether it be suicide or depression, domestic situations where, a wife has told the husband she's leaving and taking the kids and he holds them at gunpoint, to force her not to leave. And in those cases, when the police arrive, they've heard about this incident, there is no demand. There's no substantive demand to give me money or a getaway car. The only demand is to go away, and it's, in essence, the one thing that the police cannot do. So that's why when we created the FBI's negotiation unit, we called it the Crisis Negotiation Unit instead of the Hostage Negotiation Unit, denoting that we train negotiators to do a much broader range of incidents in terms of their efforts to resolve them.
All right, and you mentioned the Crisis Negotiation Unit, and you were the chief. You were I think I heard that you were the first person to hold that position as the chief of the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Unit.
That's correct.
Well, before we get into that, because I do want to find out from you, how you got into this, but I just had two more questions about negotiations. All right, first one, we talk about stalling for time. How long has a negotiation lasted? And are we talking about stalling for time for hours or days? What situations have you been put in?
Well, I've been involved in a lot of them. The average police situation around the country that happens on a daily basis, barricaded, suicidal individual, even a robber inside of a convenience store, those tend to last 6 hours or less. They're not particularly lengthy. On the FBI side of the equation, we've deal with skyjackings and, of course, right-wing militia standoffs. The Waco situation was 52 days. The Montana Freeman siege was 85. I flew to Peru when the Japanese ambassador's residence was taken by terrorists. That was 120 days. So we tend to get involved in some very complex, very lengthy situations that are really quite untypical and not something that most police officers would ever have to face. That obviously requires a very large team of negotiators working together in shifts. It's a very different process than a police officer standing down the hallway, talking to some man to the apartment door that's threatening to harm his wife. But it's the whole range. The techniques are basically similar. Just the complexity, the number of people involved is quite different.
All right. So in that situation where you have a team, I take it as the time goes by, you're switching out the different negotiators. How does that work when the whole purpose is to establish a rapport, and now all of a sudden you're saying, all right, my shift's up, here's the new guy. How does that work, and does that complicate the negotiations?
It can complicate the negotiations, but typically it's not as big a problem as people think. I mean, that can be a challenge, and we don't just arbitrarily change negotiators for the fun of it. We typically will do it when we're involved in a protracted situation that goes on for days and days or beyond. I think even the perpetrators realize we have to get some sleep and someone else has to be available to talk to them. So there's sort of a relationship transference. I would say something like, Jerry, I've been talking all day and we've got a lot of issues that we've covered. My friend Charlie or Mary or whoever is here now and is going to talk to you, until I come back tomorrow. I need my rest. I don't want to say or misunderstand anything you're saying because I'm tired. When we say that, we're actually suggesting to the perpetrator that maybe he or she is tired as well. So there's a little bit of a suggestiveness in that phrase. But the whole idea is for us not to wear ourselves out, but, to put the emotional work on the shoulders of the person we're dealing with so that, they more quickly come to a point in time where they can make better decisions.
Well, because I have been in many arrest and search situations, and that adrenaline is flowing, and everybody wants to see how the incident or the case plays out. I mean, what kind of discipline do you have that will allow you to actually step away and get that rest?
That's a tough one, and I know negotiators are no different from regular agents. For example, if there's a protracted situation, negotiator may say, our team brought this guy to the brink of surrender for 12 hours, and now we're going off shift. He's going to surrender in 2 hours, and then the other shift is going to get the benefit of all that, and we're not. Well, there's two ways you combat that. Basically, is everything's done in the team context, and we don't recognize individual negotiators in terms of putting them forward to the public. The second thing that I implemented at Waco, I told each shift of negotiators as they were leaving, if anything of consequence develops this evening or tomorrow, we will call you. We have everybody's phone numbers. We'll call you and let you know these guys are about to come out and surrender, because if they do, this will be a team success. It will not be our success. Knowing that they'll be notified if something of consequence happens allows the negotiators to go back to their hotel or homes or wherever this is taking place and get a good night's sleep, because we need them to be their best the following day. So that's a method that I've employed at Waco and have found very effective in other situations.
And then personalities. What if you've got a negotiator and you do switch out? What if you have a situation, a new negotiator has come in and they just don't get along? The bad guy just doesn't like him. That rapport is not being established quickly enough. Then what do? What if he says, I want Gary back?
Well, if it's a shift situation where you say, I want Gary to come back, you say, well, he'll be back tomorrow, but in the meantime, we have to communicate. But on the larger question you had about a particular negotiator being utilized that just doesn't connect very well with this particular perpetrator, that does happen, and not as frequently as people might imagine, but it does happen. And when it does, we have to be realistic enough to know that we're not going to force this person on them that they clearly do not like and are probably unlikely to develop rapport with. So we'll switch out negotiators, and that's fine. There are certain personality types I know that I communicate more effectively with than I do others. There might be, we have some negotiators who are very good at talking to somebody with severe mental illness, and others who are good talking to somebody with drug dependency. Some of our best negotiators are female negotiators who can be very empathic and particularly help us to close down a situation, to finish it off, to do the final convincing. So you've got to look at the personality and attributes and skill sets on your negotiation team. And it's not a bad thing occasionally to say, we need to switch gears here and change up and put another face forward. It doesn't mean that this particular negotiator failed or wasn't good. It just didn't connect with this particular person.
I can see that. All right. So you have mentioned Waco a number of times. And, of course, when I first met you, I asked you, could you come on and give a case review about Waco? And you told me you said no, but then you told me some very exciting news that explained why. Could you share that with us here?
Sure. About a year ago, the Weinstein Company bought my book rights for a TV movie that they're making. In fact, they just completed filming. It's a 6-part miniseries about Waco, starring Taylor Kitsch's David Koresh, and Michael Shannon from Boardwalk Empire is playing me. They bought my book and the book of David Thibodeau, one of the surviving Davidians, as the basis to write this 6-part miniseries. So it'll be, they've done filming and now they'll be doing the post-production work on it. It's to be released, I understand, on January 24th of 2018 on what is currently the Spike Network, but it's going to be rebranded the Paramount Network. I was able to do consulting and made several trips out to the filming in New Mexico and was able to input some of the script writing. I think it's a great project. I think they've done a really good job with it. I'm sure there will be some in the FBI that aren't happy with it. It was sort of a very traumatic event in the history of the FBI. But, they've asked me not to do any major interviews on it until we get closer to its coming out and they coordinate all that. So we'll have to wait on something more extensively. But it is coming out. It's quite exciting. It was a very interesting project to work on, and some tremendous talent involved, both in front of and behind the camera, and quite a large undertaking to put this together. So it was great fun.
All right. Well, I will be back in touch and to do that Waco case review. But since I need a case review for this episode, what would you like to share with us? Do you have another case that you can kind of go through and give us a practical application of your negotiating skills, a review of those?
Yeah, I think Waco was sort of a departure from the FBI's long-standing crisis management approach. So the primary lesson there was to do what we had always done before and not approach it in a more aggressive way that was done in Waco. That sort of undercut the negotiations. After Waco, the FBI did a major review of what happened out there and created the Critical Incident Response Group, which was intended to be a coordinating entity over all of the various components that respond to and help resolve a crisis, the negotiation program, the FBI's hostage rescue team, and technical units and aviation units and so forth. 3 years after Waco, we had an incident in Jordan, Montana, dealing with a group called the Freemen, an anti-government group that had engaged in a wide range of federal criminal violations, had threatened to kidnap and hang a federal judge, and had really overwhelmed the resources of the very small 2-man police department in that jurisdiction. So the FBI was asked to play a role, noting that David Koresh at Waco, if he had been arrested, away from the compound, that the situation might have ended very differently. The FBI devised a plan to lure out from these collection of ranches the 2 leaders and effectively arrest them. And that was done in a great operation. But the downside was we didn't fully appreciate the fact that the remaining freemen were pretty rudderless in terms of making decisions and were unable to make any decisions. So what resolved was an 85-day long conflict. And the challenges facing the FBI were that we could not afford to have another Waco and be seen in the public as having mishandled another situation. Not only were we aware of that, but so were the freemen, who thereby didn't feel particularly threatened. They felt pretty self-assured that we would not take any egregious action. So it was a tough negotiations. Again, they didn't want anything from us other than for us to go away and to recognize that we had no sovereignty over them. But what we did very innovatively as negotiators, we creatively used a wide range of intermediaries, some dealing with various family members who were inside, others who were of a political nature. We slowly began to entice people out, undercut the full small group of people who were making the decisions. Ultimately, we brought them to direct negotiations with the FBI, and we were able to achieve a peaceful surrender. It took 85 days. No shots were fired. Everybody came out alive. And we're all very proud of that, but of course it received relatively little news attention because unlike the Waco incident, there was no dramatic fire at the end and the loss of life. And so it sort of fell off the media's interest. But nonetheless, it was an operation that fully exercised the new coordinated, elements that the FBI had put together on the Critical Incident Response Group. And in this case, the director, Louis Freeh, who was not the director during Waco, made it quite clear that we were going to negotiate this one out. And that was done quite effectively, and we were all very proud of that. So that was, I think, coming on the heels of Waco, a remanifestation of doing what we'd known how to do before and had done very successfully.
Now, how were you able to accomplish that? Because you had told us that at the beginning you had already taken the leadership into custody and that the people who remained weren't able to make a decision. So how were you able to get them to come together and make a decision to, I take it they all surrendered?
They did. We had to chip away at their resolve. Initially, there was, I can't remember now off the top of my head the number of people, 20, 30 people living on these ranches that were connected out in the middle of almost nowhere. And we purposely did not put roadblocks on their property. We dressed down from our normal tactical garb. We tried to deal with them in a very relaxed and respectful way. And as they refused to talk directly with us until about halfway or more through the incident, we had to use people we identified who had relationships of trust that could go in and, after being briefed by us, sort of present the arguments and the rationales that we represented or we voiced to them. And, most of those were pretty successful. Some of them were directed at just getting their relative to come out. Others were, had a larger goal in mind in terms of getting the freemen to realize that we weren't going away and that they needed this opportunity in court to tell their side of the story in terms of their beliefs about what the government did and did not control. So, I mean, it was, I'm trying to put in just a few words here what was a very complex situation, but I think it was a manifestation of a very creative approach to solving the problem. And one of the things we also did is we through some maneuvers and some visible efforts, we slowly planted a seed of doubt in their mind that our patience was endless and that we were prepared to take tactical action that, truth and fact, we probably were not. But we were able to convince them that we were getting to a point where it was in their best interest to really negotiate in earnest versus continue to resist.
Did you utilize the assistance of the leadership that you had in custody?
We did. At one point in time, I mentioned that there was an effort to rule by group after the two leaders were gone, and it strangled them from making any decision. It became very challenging. So we helped promote Edwin Clark, who was one of the ranch owners and a very decent man. He got caught up in this, I think, for a lot of different reasons, but we recognized that he was basically a decent human being that we could work with. And we slowly undertook efforts to promote his position of leadership with those people who were still inside. And eventually Edwin asked us if he could meet with the two leaders we had arrested. Was convinced that he had already made up his mind to surrender and lead the others out, but he wanted their blessing. And in fact, we flew him out of the crisis site to meet with the two leaders in jail. in Billings, Montana, and then we flew him back and let him go back in. I mean, it's unprecedented. It's nothing like that's ever been done before, but it was very effective. And in fact, the two incarcerated leaders said, yes, come out, but preserve the evidence that makes the case for our legal basis. And that's what we did. We allowed them to preserve that evidence and work with Edwin, who was very concerned about, everyone's life and coming out peacefully. And it just took time to establish his responsibility and his leadership role, and it worked out very well.
Well, that seems like a big risk. I mean, how did you know for sure that he wasn't going to go to the leaders and they were going to say, oh, by all means, resist and, fight?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and the question that was posed to me by our senior decision makers at the time. And having met personally with Edwin Clark to discuss this issue, I was convinced that Edwin had made up his mind to come out. He simply wanted the blessing of those two to sort of put icing on the cake. My view was that had either of them said, don't come out, he still would have done it. But he preferred to do it with their blessing. Fortunately for us, we got that blessing, which made the decision, I think, an easier one for him and an easier decision for him to sell to the others. There were several inside who were very much against surrendering. So he had a tough uphill battle in convincing them. But that's sort of the way it worked. There are some judgments that have to be made in negotiations and some analysis and consideration. And sometimes it doesn't work out the way you want, and you go back to the drawing board. But, you make your best recommendation based on the facts and circumstances. And you've got to be able to articulate and make the case for why you want to do what you want to do, which, that's how the process works. For the FBI officials to allow this, I had to convince them. And that's the way it should be. There should have been a burden on me as the negotiation leader to say, hey, here's why I think we should do this. If I had failed to convince them, then, they probably would have been well justified in saying, no, we're not going to let this happen.
All right. So now you've just told us about utilizing family members and people with relationships of trust. Sometimes on movies, on TV, you see negotiators bringing the girlfriend or the mother to the scene to talk to whoever is barricaded, behind the door. Does that happen?
Well, I just mentioned in the Freeman situation how we did use some family members, but I must say that is not in any way, shape, or form a typical situation, and there was a lot of compelling reasons we did that. In the average situation, if the mother of a perpetrator, let's say a guy's inside a convenience store with hostages, and he says, I want to talk to my mom, we would typically say no, because our fear is that the perpetrator will use that direct contact, that dialogue, as an opportunity to present their last will and testament. Mom, I'm sorry it came to this. I can't go back to prison. I've got some money stashed away here. Be sure and get it. And I loved you, and bye-bye. Or in some cases, let me talk to my girlfriend, and you're the one that made me do this. Whatever it might be, we don't know the full extent of the family dynamics. We have too many case examples where allowing that direct contact has led directly to very bad, fatal consequences. So with that in mind, what we would recommend typically would be, let's have mom or girlfriend or whoever it might be make a very upbeat, positive recording, encouraging the person to come out. But preventing a direct dialogue where they can say this last goodbye and provide this verbal will. So, the family member would say, I love you, please come out, I'll be here when you come out, we'll be able to talk. And hold that as the ability to meet with the person they want to meet with as sort of a reward for good behavior. Hey, if you put your gun down and let those people come out, and you come out, I guarantee you we'll let you sit down with your girlfriend, your mom, your brother, whoever it might be, and you'll have an opportunity to talk with them, but not until you do that. And I would tell somebody up front, here's why I don't want you to talk to your mom. I don't want you to say goodbye to her. A lot of people think negotiations is a lot more trickery than it is. It's just up front being honest and genuine and sincere. Why won't you let me talk to my mom? Here's why. I've worked many cases where somebody's killed themselves after we've let them do that. So I can't do that in good conscience. I think that gives you, a lot of veracity in what you say and credibility.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I could see somebody really feeling that you care about them after you've made, that type of a statement.
Yeah, I think a lot of times in negotiations, we try to come up with, some fancy reason why we will or will not do something when the real answer can be pretty simple. Well, why are all those police officers outside my house? Well, Mr. Smith, you fired 3 shots from your rifle, and we have a responsibility to make sure citizens stay away from here and nobody gets hurt. And we're concerned about what's happened in the house. Is someone hurt? Are you hurt? That's why these police officers responded here, not because we want to hurt you, but we have an obligation now to make sure this is resolved safely and peacefully, and let's work together and make that happen. We don't have to make up some fancy excuse, and just tell it like it is. And sometimes we can cite real-life chaos and confusion as a reason something hasn't been done or can't be done in a timely fashion.
I smiled when you said that because, as you know, one of the there's all kinds of little sayings and stuff that we say as FBI agents, and one of them is, of course, we're here to help.
Yeah.
We're here to help you.
Well, I think, but just on that point real quick, it's okay to say, we're good guys and we're here to help, but what a negotiator has to do is to demonstrate it. Instead of just saying, I'm listening, we are demonstrating we're listening because we paraphrase back what the person has told us. If we hear emotion in the voice, we repeat that. We say, we've talked for a while, Mr. Smith, and what I'm understanding is you were really, really upset at your boss because he fired you 6 months before you're eligible to retire, and this has just devastated you. You don't know what to say to your wife. You don't know where to turn. You just feel like you've been unappreciated on this job and that you've been treated badly. Well, what that person's going to say, if I got it right, was, yes, you understand me. And I get that only through explaining what I've heard to him, not just saying, yeah, I understand. We have to demonstrate it and show it and prove that we understand. And that's a powerful tool once we've made that demonstration.
We've talked about this beautiful rapport building, but there has to be situations where you are just so frustrated and so angry at this person because maybe you've taken 2 steps forward and now they've gone backwards. What do you do with that when they aren't doing what you want them to do?
Well, that can be extremely frustrating. I mean, a lot of times we'd like to, in an instructional way, graph this constant show of improvement with the passage of each incremental period of time. You see, it's getting better and better and better, and you can track that. And we can demonstrate that for our bosses. The language is less violent. The phone calls are of longer duration. He said some positive things about his hostages that he didn't want to hurt him. I can track all those things and show you a solid, predictable line towards success. And that happens quite frequently. But there are also those cases where it is, as you said, Jerry, it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There are those perpetrators who are not clear in their own mind what they want and don't have a clear sense of how they want to get this thing resolved. The only thing they know for sure is while they don't want to stay in this situation, they don't want to go to jail. So their default decision becomes no decision. And it can be very frustrating when you think you've walked someone to the brink of a successful conclusion, and then at the last minute they back away. So those are really tough, but it requires a lot of patience and persistence. And also negotiators have to be able to tell the command decision makers, this is what we're trying to accomplish. This is what we think will happen. I can't guarantee you that the person will follow through and do what they say, because it is not uncommon for people to change their mind. But we're slowly moving in this direction. There will be some peaks and valleys ahead, but overall, the peaks aren't as high and the valleys aren't as deep. That's one way of looking at it. So we should still be able to track some relationship improvement as we walk down the trail with this person towards a successful outcome. The negotiator always has to remember that losing your cool or getting angry is not going to achieve anything. So it's don't get angry, get your way is sort of a working guideline for us. You may feel temporary, vindication by pointing out this person's deficiencies or arguing back or hurling an insult back at them. That's really not going to accomplish your goal. Your goal is to get the final success, which is the peaceful surrender or the peaceful safe release of a hostage or a victim, whatever it might be. So we have to constantly keep in mind it's not about you and it's not about your feelings as a negotiator. It's about you overcoming these personal verbal attacks, which are not uncommon, and moving this further towards the goal of getting people to come out. So don't get angry, get your way. And, that is an age-old problem, continues to be with a lot of departments around the country and around the world, where the tactical teams become very frustrated because something's taking so long, and they have a tendency to want to take some initiative to make things happen, just to be seen as doing something. And often it's the wrong thing. Often it's better to do nothing than to do something that's going to further inflame the situation, create mistrust, counter the good feelings that the negotiation team is working on. So that's why these things have to be very carefully coordinated. We have to speak with one voice.
Well, one of the things that I saw in your bio is that you have used these negotiation skills during extraterritorial jurisdiction matters where there is a American citizen overseas who's been kidnapped. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I see so many difficulties when it comes to that type of negotiation, because I would assume in most cases you don't even speak the same language as the person you're trying to negotiate with.
Yeah, from 1990 to 2003, when I retired, the FBI worked about 120 kidnappings overseas involving American citizens. And I'm sure the FBI has worked at least that many again since I retired. However, in those cases, rarely, on a few occasions, but very rarely would we actually be conducting face-to-face or direct communications with the perpetrators, the kidnappers. Typically, we would be advising a family member, a corporate communicator, someone, a local police officer, someone who is in direct contact with the kidnappers. But we use some of the same goals in kidnapping. The kidnappers it's a very quid pro quo activity. They want money for something, very instrumental, and more than it is an emotional situation. It's a business for them. But if you just give them a huge amount of money right up, then they're going to want more and think that they got that money so easily that there must be a lot more. So the negotiation challenge is really to get the victim released as a hostage in the shortest amount of time for the least amount of money. Not for the sake of saving money, but for the sake of not incentivizing the kidnappers where they re-victimize the family or the company or even the nationality, saying, boy, these Americans pay a lot of money real quick, so let's go after them again. There is, in most organized kidnapping events, and it is more often an organized event. Mexico City right now is probably the number one kidnap capital in the world. It used to be Colombia. But for those folks, it's a money-making proposition. There is a market value, an expectation for how much they expect to get for an American tourist or an American businessman that they've gotten hold of. So we have to, in one sense, disregard the demand, normally a very significant amount of money being asked for, and rather focus on what are their expectations, what has been paid by other companies or families in the past period of time for Americans who are kidnapped in this part of Mexico or in Colombia or Venezuela, wherever it might be. So that established market value gives us a sense of the expectations of the kidnappers. That and that alone has to be where we focus and not on what is probably an exorbitant demand. For example, a CEO of a company, a negotiator might say, they've asked for $10 million. And all of a sudden everybody says, well, we can't pay $10 million. That's outrageous. You say, wait a minute, that's what they asked for. They probably only expect to get $1 million. So let's work from there in terms of devising a negotiation strategy so we can get to that $1 million mark in the shortest amount of time possible. So that would be sort of in a very general way the way the process works.
I thought that we don't negotiate with.
Well, the U.S. government will not make substantive concessions. There has been a modification of the U.S. government's policy as long overdue, and the U.S. government will negotiate. It just won't make substantive concessions, nor should it. But
what does that mean? I mean,
well, in other words, if somebody says I've got an American citizen, I want the U.S. government to give me, $100 million, I don't think the U.S. government should ever pay a penny for an American citizen to be released. That being said, I do not oppose a family or a corporation from paying money for the release of their employee or their loved one, as the case may be. Number one, there's a much lower expectation of financial resources with a company or a family than there is the government. But governments can't afford to be seen as capitulating to terrorists particularly. By the way, there's no prohibition against American companies or families paying money to a criminal kidnapping, which is the overwhelming majority. Only if it's a terrorist group on the State Department's list could potentially the payment of ransom be seen as violating U.S. law. However, the new policy revision that occurred at the end of the Obama administration now gives much more flexibility for families to pursue these resolution strategies with the input and coordination of the government, but not the money of the government. The government will not pay the money. So I think it's a step in the right direction, and hopefully it's leading to better outcomes for American citizens.
I really want to hear, I think we all want to hear, how you got into this. I mean, it sounds fascinating. I was a psychology major, kind of regretting that I didn't look into this as part of my FBI career because it sounds fascinating.
Yeah, when I went through New Agents Training School, hostage negotiation was almost a brand new specialty that the FBI was getting into. It was really developed by NYPD, and the FBI saw very quickly it was a great concept, and using our international and national resources, we expanded the understanding of it in a more scientific way. We began to teach it around the United States and around the world, and it's probably saved more lives than anything else law enforcement's ever done. It usually ends successfully, and therefore a lot of people discount it and say, well, that must have been easy. The person must have wanted to surrender anyway. And it's really a lack of appreciation for what negotiators do. But be that as it may, I heard about this new field, and it's something about it, even as a brand new agent being trained, really appealed to me. So I think it took another 5 years after I was in the field working investigations that I had an opportunity to attend the FBI's negotiation course and became the field coordinator in the Washington field office, where I worked very closely with the police, Metropolitan Police Department negotiation team, did a lot of training and teaching, and eventually worked some pretty significant situations to the point where they asked me to become one of the then 3 full-time FBI negotiators back at the FBI Academy, and then eventually was made the chief of a new unit that was formed to expand that program after Waco. And yeah, that's how I got into it. It was something that I was intrigued by and seemed to fit well with my personality and my skills, and the rest is history, as I say.
And what are you doing now? I met you at Thriller Fest giving presentations. Do you do a lot of that work?
I do a fair amount. I've cut way back. I mean, I retired from the FBI in 2003, and I went to work full-time for 5 years for Control Risk, which is an international risk consultancy, and I headed up the Washington office and primarily helped corporations prepare to manage and actually manage overseas kidnapping incidents based on my experience with the FBI. I did that full-time for 5 years. Then I was fortunate to have Random House, pay me to write a book, my book, which I did, but that required me to go part-time as a consultant, which I did for another 4 or 5 years. And then eventually I just primarily give presentations now to corporations, not necessarily on kidnapping, but based on my book, using negotiation skills in life and work to create more harmonious work environments and better sales with clients and better relationships with vendors and whatever it might be. And for many people, just to be better individuals at home and work. Getting cooperation. Human beings are social animals. We require, dealing with others in almost every facet of our lives, and being able to communicate more effectively with not only strangers, but those we live with and love and cherish, we often take for granted. So applying the lessons learned from, being in the FBI for 30 years as a negotiator and applying them in life has been a lot of fun. I enjoy giving those presentations. I still do them fairly frequently, not nearly as much as I used to, because I live in a beautiful lake in Virginia, and I like to enjoy it as much as I can these days.
Well, I will put a link to your website with the show notes for this episode. So if anybody does want to reach out to you and see about having you come speak at their university or for their organization, they'll be able to contact you. I will also put up your book cover and a link to your book, which again is Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. And I will also remind everyone now, and again in the beginning of next year, the miniseries that was adapted from your book on Waco will be airing around January 24th of 2018. And as we get closer to that, I will confirm the date and make sure everybody is tuned in.
Well, it's very much appreciated, Jerry.
So I want to give you the last word. We've had a long conversation here. You can leave us with what you want us to know, the main thing you want us to know about negotiations. You could talk about your book, the miniseries. You have the last word. What would you like to say?
Well, I think when we all consider that negotiations is part of everyday life, one of the real important keys to remember is how you say something is as important or more important than what you say. So your tone, your demeanor, for most of us, this occurs in a face-to-face context. So your body language, your expression, a demonstration of your interest in hearing someone else's point of view, even someone you disagree with, and listening attentively, and then taking the opportunity to share your feelings with them only when you've earned the right in their mind by having first listened to them. I think these are important things. So think about, avoiding sarcasm and accusatory tone in the way you speak, and being genuine and likable. And I think it's particularly important in today's very polarized political atmosphere, where we tend to gravitate toward very polarized camps in the political process. And I think it's important to realize that not everybody that thinks a little differently than you is a bad person or an evil person, and take the time to listen to their point of view, and you'll probably find there's a lot more commonality than not. And that's an effective way to be an influencer and to be respected and to have an impact on people's lives.
And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Gary Noesner. You'll find a link to the FBI website's page on hostage negotiations, and you'll find additional articles on Gary Noesner. There's also a link to Gary's book, Stalling for Time. If you enjoyed the interview, I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of the episode show notes, you'll find all the social media share buttons. And of course, if you're listening to this on your phone or iPad, you can share it directly from your device. Up next is Pay to Play, the audiobook. The first chapter, where you are introduced to Stu Sebastiani, the corrupt licensing and inspection city official Special Agent Kerry Wheeler is investigating. He's a womanizer and a cheater in more ways than one. The book was inspired by true crime FBI cases featuring strip clubs, extortion, sex, money, and more. So Pay to Play is gritty and raw. I have taken the time to delete out some of the strong language, but I understand that Pay to Play may not be for everyone. In writing this book, I was trying to keep it real. I hope you enjoy it. Here's Pay to Play.
Chapter 1. Stu Sebastiani tucked a C-note down the server's sequined bra and raised his voice above the pulsing music. "Can I cop a feel for $100 bill?" The curvaceous blonde in her glittery halter and hot pants smiled, signaling consent in Sebastiani's mind. However, when he patted her butt, she scowled and dislodged his hand from her backside with a well-placed slug to his solar plexus. He winced and then laughed in spite of the pain. Didn't she know who he was? He was responsible for the place jumping off tonight, and as part of the compensation for his behind-the-scenes contributions, he felt entitled to a bit of bad behavior. He had spent the first half of the evening playing a one-sided game of grab-ass with the cocktail waitresses and dancers scurrying about the congested floor. His son Artie was a minority owner of Jolie, Philadelphia's newest and most exclusive gentlemen's club. Tonight was the grand opening, and he planned to get his party on. He massaged his now bruised abdomen and surveyed the club. The crowd was so deep no one could possibly take note of the painstakingly selected interior decor. So much fuss about the dimensions of the chandeliers, the grade of marble for the floors, and those ridiculous Grecian sculptures. They should have listened to him. The only thing the customers care about was the babes. "Dad!" Artie appeared at Sebastiani's side and leaned in close to shout into his ear. "I saw that. You know you're not supposed to touch." "Can you blame me?" Sebastiani angled his head toward the luscious rear end of the cocktail waitress bending over to place an order of drinks on the next table. "I'm glad you took my advice and hired girls with a little something extra that jiggles when you smack it. Some of them are complaining. Most don't mind. How am I to know which ones do?" He pantomimed pinching the round bottom of an unsuspecting brunette scooching by, but knew better than to feel up the paying customers. "Why don't you go hang with your buddy Bill Leone?" "Nah, he's all sour grapes tonight." Sebastiani caught a view through the crowd of his old friend parked at center stage, sipping a drink while checking out the featured entertainer, Lola or Lolly or something like that. Leone was probably scheming to book her at his club. "He did tell me earlier that I should claim partial credit for your success." "Why?" "'Cause you inherited my appreciation for the female anatomy." "I don't know about that." "Sure, he's right." Sebastiani grinned at Artie. "You may have earned your master's in business administration from Wharton, but you earned your master's in boobs and ass by studying with your old man." "That's so uncool, Dad." Artie let out an exaggerated sigh. "I hope you're not telling people that." "Don't forget, I introduced you to your business partners. And thank God I can always count on you to remind me of that." Artie muttered something else, but Sebastiani couldn't understand what he said. He ignored his son's reproach and looked past him, into the crowd, where he spied one of his pals from the old neighborhood. He called him over. "Jimmy Mastrocola." Sebastiani greeted him with a hearty embrace and a kiss on the cheek. "Glad you could make it. This place is something else. You should be proud of yourself, Junior." Mastrocola pulled Artie into a bear hug. "Thanks, Uncle Jimmy." "You too, Stu." Mastrocola bumped fists with Sebastiani. "I'm sure you were an unofficial consultant on all this. We were just saying how he got his MBA from me." He winked at Mastrocola. "Masters in boobs and ass." Mastrocola laughed and nodded. "No one knows more about strip clubs than you." Sebastiani gave Artie a playful nudge. A frown creased Artie's brow. "Come with me, Uncle Jimmy," he said, changing the subject. "I want to introduce you to my business associates. They had something to do with this, too." "Yeah, let's go see 'em." Sebastiani patted Artie on the back and smiled. "I got a surprise for you guys." "What is it?" "Just you wait." Artie stared at him for a beat, sighed, and led them through the crush of bodies and introduced Mastrocola to Lynette Hampton and Curtis Kincaid, both dressed for the occasion. She wore sequins and black silk, and so did he. Sebastiani high-fived the partners and liked the way Lynette's breasts bounced in her low-cut dress when he slapped her hand. "Great crowd, Lynette. The house is packed." "Should be." She stood with one hand on her hip. "We spent nearly $250,000 on marketing." "Yeah, great ad campaign. Billboards, flyers, and all that social media stuff." He scanned her body. Her ass was starting to look a little flat. Too bad. She used to have such a nice one. "But maybe," he continued, "everybody's here because your closest competitors are temporarily shut down." Artie slid toward Sebastiani and leaned in, his eyes dark and questioning. "What do you mean, Dad? What did you do?" "L&I is conducting a semi-annual inspection of all the clubs in South Philly." He stepped sideways to allow more space between them. "The crackdowns are tonight." "What a coincidence." "What the hell?" Artie gripped his arm. "You can't just order up a raid to get us more business. You've got to call off your Department of Licenses and Inspections people right now." Sebastiani pretended to be unconcerned, but his mouth was suddenly dry, and there was a thickness in his throat. He raised an imaginary glass to his lips as a signal to a waitress standing nearby that he needed a drink. "Can't you see the beauty of it all? When my guys roll in, their customers leave and come here." He looked at each partner. How could they not understand what he had done for them? "I can't believe you pulled such a boneheaded stunt," said Kincaid. His words and spittle were both forced through clenched teeth. "After all we've done to appear legit." Sebastiani glanced around the room. The music seemed to have gotten louder. The thumping rhythm made his heart beat faster. He could feel the vibrations in his feet. "Stu, I'm talking to you." He gave Kincaid a stiff half-smile. "It's all good. Trust me." Lynette moved in closer. Her potent perfume made his eyes blink. He recalled how, after he had been with her, he'd have to scrub away her scent before he could go home. Jabbing one of her lacquered talons in his face, she said, "You need to go." Sebastiani flung his arms wide. "You're kicking me out of here? You guys need me." He turned to Artie. "Tell them." "We'll talk about that later." Artie tugged on his sleeve. "Right now, you need to call off your boys." Sebastiani yanked his arm away and inadvertently bumped into Kincaid, who flinched, immediately took a weak defensive stance, and raised his fists in the air. "Really?" Sebastiani glared at Kincaid, daring him to make a move. "Aren't you afraid you'll mess up your outfit?" "Stop it!" Artie stepped between them. "He'll stay and straighten everything out." "You better fix this," said Kincaid. He wagged his finger at Sebastiani and then stomped away, sputtering obscenities. Lynette followed close behind, glaring back at him even as she greeted a guest with a warm hug and kiss. Sebastiani stood motionless with his arms stiff against his sides. He looked at Artie, who was shaking his head. He glanced over at Mastrocola, who appeared to be embarrassed for him. "But it worked. They came," said Sebastiani. "But Dad, it wasn't your place to do anything. You should have asked me." Artie pointed to the rear bar. "Go sit back there and make some calls to clean up this mess. Try to keep a low profile." 2 hours later, Sebastiani, still entrenched at the far side of the club where Artie had banished him, slumped on a bar stool, his upper body draped over the counter. Just below his alcohol buzz, he detected his suppressed anger. How come everyone else got to have it all, but he was supposed to be satisfied with scraps? He ran the side of his hand slowly across the stubble on his cheek, tilted his glass to his lips, and guzzled down his Jameson. "They can all suck my hairy balls," he mumbled to himself. "Lay low. Hell no." No one had been upset when he used his connections to make sure zoning permits and construction inspections sailed through without a hitch. Now, after they had taken advantage of the courtesies his position provided, they acted like they didn't know him. So what if Artie got a small share in the business? He wanted his own payday. They owed him. "Come here for a minute." He waved the bartender over. His head was at her chest level. He wished he could bury his face in those fleshy, plump mounds. He spoke to her cleavage. "Did you know I named this joint? Those Heads wanted to call it Jolie Visage, like dudes would come in here to check out pretty faces. I told him, he said, his tongue thick and doughy. I told him, skip that highbrow French. Just call it Jolie, like that hot piece actress. The bartender reached for the whiskey glass resting next to Sebastiani's head. As wasted as he was, he still managed to snatch it before she could take it away. While she waited, he lapped up the remaining brown liquid coating the bottom and sides of the empty glass, then wriggled his tongue at her. I hope you got it all, she said over her shoulder as she walked away with the tumbler, 'cause that was your last one. Sebastiani pounded his fist on the bar. I'm not gonna let him stick me in the corner like some smacked ass. He whirled his finger around the wet ring left behind on the bar, collecting himself. He smiled. Tanny. He would get Tanny a job at Jolie. She would be his spy. She would make sure he got his fair share of the business he had helped build. Tanny would make sure he got what he deserved.
Pay to Play in ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook is available now at Amazon.com. The audiobook is also available at Audible and iTunes. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.